society organizations, art institutions, through European human rights and policy bodies. Main areas of interest are feminist knowledge production, critical policy studies, and intersectional discrimination. She was also one of the participants of the OFF-Biennale in 2021. So welcome back, and let's keep up the conversation.
Thank you so much, Kati, for the introduction, and I also would like to welcome everyone. Thank you so much also for the crew who was setting up the technicalities, and also thank you so much for the organizers of the OFF-Biennale who were making this event happen, and thank you so much also for the audience, both online and offline, who came here and you are interested in this discussion. So, üdvözlök mindenkit, welcome everyone. My name is Marina Csikós, and I will be moderating the session titled Practices of Change in Communities of Today and Tomorrow Towards Institutions of the Future. My journey with OFF-Biennale started in 2021, as Kati mentioned, in spring, when I joined Andrea Pocic, who was yesterday with us, with whom we co-organized an exhibition dedicated to the unique artist and her memorial, Olamara Omara. Art always had an important part in my life, as I guess in many of us. It gave me hope in the miserable times, in the dark times, how we say it in these days. And yeah, it was a channel for me to express my emotions when speaking was not enough. And it also provided me with a community when I felt abandoned and lonely. However, already at a very young age, I have realized that there is a difference between arts, or rather, the difference between who makes the art. While my white Hungarian peers and friends proudly walked through the museums during the different trips, taught poems in literature classes in Hungarian, I have always felt a bit strange. I was missing something, and it was my Roma heritage. I have already knew at an early age that Roma music, paintings, actors, heroines were almost invisible in the different institutions. While at home, in my Roma neighborhood in Szabolcs County, we heard about the 100-member Gypsy Orchestra, Csolidaróczi József and his poems, and listened to the amazing tales with Roma heroes and heroines from our grandparents. As you may guess from the title, in today's discussion, we will be talking about different communities and how they generate changes in our societies and structures from an artistic and cultural point of view. In times of darkness, solidarity, care, and empathy keep communities alive. This is what Arman Heljic said during our preparation discussion, and I think it's really true. This discussion aims to bring solidarity, care, and empathy also to all of us in such a chaotic political and social times in Hungary and elsewhere. While marginalized and especially communities without a nation state, such as Roma and Kurdish people, for instance, many times fight for national recognition and for a more formal institutionalization. Finally, I got the word. There is also a very strong desire for remaining community-based. By existing in this dichotomy, Roma, Palestinian, Kurdish, and other artists create, maintain, and they also continue the discussions about. And yeah, in this discussion, we will talk about and we will discuss such questions, such as how can a single national museum represent the entire country's diversity? Why are mainstream formal institutions so slow to catch up with the dynamic changes and developments which are generated by marginalized communities, such as Roma feminist queer artists? What are the roles of NGOs and academia and artistic and cultural production from a minority point of view? These questions, among many others, will be answered and further discussed by the panelists, who are Arman Heljic, PhD candidate in Gender Studies at the Department of Cultural Science, Gothenburg University, Lara Khaldi, who is an artistic director at Appel, Amsterdam, Payam Sharifi from the Slavs and Tatars, and also Natali Tomenko, who is currently a fellow, and she is also a Roma artist and cultural heritage expert. I would like to thank you so much once again for accepting the invitation and contributing to this discussion. Each discussant, we will have around 6-7 minutes to share their interventions, and I really would like to ask them to keep the time limits, because we will also have some time for discussions afterwards, and also we also would like to interact with the audience. So now I would like to turn to our speakers, and our first discussant will be Natali Tomenko, who is talking about her art therapy practice, working with Roma communities from Ukraine, and also about the decolonization of museums within the context of Roma cultural heritage in Ukraine. So Natali, please, the floor is yours.
Please tell me if the sound is fine. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you, Marina, so much for introduction and in general for this opportunity to contribute to OFF-Biennale and being invited and to talk to great experts today. I apologize so much for the background noise. I'm traveling today and it's the most silent place I could found ever. So I will continue today, very briefly, shortly, talking about two important topics for me and for current Roma community in Ukraine. The first one, it's about the practice of decolonization of museums within the context of Roma cultural heritage in Ukraine, and I will tell you later why it's important for me and for the state and for community in general. And the second topic is community engagement into knowledge production nowadays within the context of traumatic experience gained during the ongoing war in Ukraine. So starting with the first topic of decolonization of museums, I wanted to give you a background how I started to be engaged into this area. So it was usually, like always, bothering me to see the lack of representation or misrepresentation of Roma heritage in cultural institutions in Ukraine. And 2019, I started to work on a topic of my main thesis, defining of Roma cultural heritage in Ukraine. And while researching, I found a really global issue. There is a lack of understanding what should be considered as Roma heritage in the scope of a state. And while analyzing different perceptions from experts, looking at public discourse, media, I found several manifestations of anti-Gypsyism, what actually affect later on what has been exhibited so far and in what way. Yeah, and the well-known academic term of othering of Roma communities puts the culture in general in a disadvantaged position and gives the power to cultural decision makers in a state, where they put, for example, Ukrainian heritage on a position of authority and dominant culture, and so on. It creates a other image of Roma community and the heritage of the community in general. And into the context of decolonization practices within my research, I propose an inclusive heritization process by discovering community perceptions on their own heritage. And as far as the Roma community in Ukraine is very diverse and not homogeneous, so it's a huge discourse how to collect all those perceptions. Yeah, and to not go deep into findings, I just would like to outline that so far I made a mapping to see different opinions and acknowledgements of different subgroups of Roma in Ukraine, and proposing an establishment of a virtual community museum where the authority will be shared between different stakeholders. What will make this concept as inclusive? Yes, it will be not just state authorities who will tell what is our heritage, but actually community members will talk. That's what we want to be exhibited, that's our heritage, and that's how it should look like, yeah? And that's briefly, I covered the first topic, and going into second one within the community work that we are doing nowadays with my organization Arca in Ukraine. Nowadays knowledge production by the Roma community has been transformed and also impacted by the existence of the war in the country. And yeah, based on my personal experience in facing the war trauma, I started to work on post-traumatic experience symptoms for myself while incorporating some artistic practice. And yeah, actually, it's somehow relevant to today's discussions of time of darkness, how to find the light. So the art became, it used to be always the light, but this particular time, it was really a strong point to support myself. Yeah, and within the Goethe Institute in Mannheim previous year, who provided the support, and there was also a curation from the side of Documentation Center for Roma Sinti in Heidelberg. And within this program, I had an art residency where I produced several art pieces using this art therapy methodics. So I actually saw that this practice helped me, and I wanted to share it with others. And so on was established a workshop for Roma and pro-Roma women, where I was leading the art therapy workshops with them. It was a safe space. It was a very small group, 10 people, but the experience that they got, as they later on shared, impacted on how they are processing the trauma nowadays. Of course, we cannot erase the whole traumatic experience, but there is a time of diminishing maybe the effect on later on post like transgenerational trauma, which will happen anyway. Yeah, but the way how it will happen, we can impact nowadays today on it. Yeah, and later on, after this knowledge production that happened during the workshop, we received actually a lot of material, tangible pieces, and there came up the idea to establish an archive of these works. And so on was created the first exhibition, Catharsis, that was exhibited in December in Berlin first time, and it's ongoing project. So we are planning to exhibit it in different cities and countries, and hopefully in Vienna, in Austria, it will be soon. Yeah, and that was the example of community work and how art practices are being used nowadays in our projects in Ukraine. But besides of that, there are other opportunities how we are actually engaging nowadays Roma artists from Ukraine. For example, there was an open call of Artists at Risk together established this area, European Roma Institute of Arts and Culture, and ARCA, where we are trying to engage artists and to provide for them 3 months residency in European art institutions. Yes, that's like the first try to support the artists in this time of darkness. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward for your questions later on.
Great. Thank you so much, Natali, for your intervention. And it's actually really interesting that how current politics and social changes affect how our communities interact with different, art and cultural productions and different events as well. So it was really interesting to hear how the Ukrainian Roma community and Ukrainian Roma artists actually coping with trauma, and different very difficult changes. So thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Arman Heljic, who is hopefully will talk about the role and how unrecognized potential of queer feminist art, especially in Romani communities, and how they change these changes in institutional practices. I would like to ask Arman to join to the conversation. Thank you.
Yes, I hope that you hear me. Do you hear me? Yes, okay, wonderful. So thank you for this invitation, and it's really a pleasure and honor to participate in this beautiful panel. And I have not spoken on such an occasion before, on Zoom before, so I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm very glad to share some of my thoughts regarding queer and feminist contributions to this sort of debate that we are having. And while we were preparing, we were sort of discussing about the unrecognized potential, actually, that either artists who directly identify as queer, feminist, or Roma, whether queer refers to the sexuality or to the practice itself, which means to sort of go against the norm. I do not make this discrimination in the distinction, but I will go a little bit into that later on in the conversation. What I want to start with, and also maybe continue a little bit on what Natali was saying, I think that what I'm, through my PhD sort of like topic, which is very close to what I'm talking about today, is I'm realizing the huge legacy that Gypsy Lorism left also on art and visual representations of Roma across Europe. And now I'm year 6 in reading books about this topic, so it's a huge body of basically work that I think has recently, in the past 5 to 10 years, been a serious subject of sort of like investigation, not only scholarly, which makes me extremely happy, but also artists engage with misrepresentations of, for example, Romani women in visual art and paintings, for example, to performances, theater practices, and so on and so forth, which creates this huge sort of potential for all of us to imagine what our Romani identities actually are beyond what has been left by Gypsy Lorism. And for those of you who do not know what Gypsy Lorism is, it is a very specific form of orientalization that is targeting European but also global Romani populations. And it is a practice that started somewhere in the 1700s and lasted, one of my opponents argues that we can still not talk about the legacies and in past tense because we are still dealing with it. When it comes to this, I mentioned this because in terms of institutions, we have to also think that institutions have been a part of this. And this is something that makes this process of decolonization extremely difficult, because we have to work as scholars, activists, and artists and collectives in deconstructing these institutions and sitting together with them in order to first make them aware that they have been an active participant in creating the problem. And I think that we are some steps already deep in this process, while my PhD thesis identifies the fact that sort of like queer and LGBT population in general, but also feminists are lagging behind in this recognition. When I say this, I mean, and the reasons for this might be various. Whether it might not always be homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, etc., but I do think that it is to a certain degree part of the problem, because when a narrative is explicitly feminist, it has a chance to, and it goes within the narrative of Romani nation building, and preserving sort of like some traditional values, then it is out there and it's mainstreamed, while at the same time queer representations, when they are more sexualized, for example, and stem from sexualized epistemologies, they do not really explicitly reach the main discourses within theorizations as such. So, for example, behind me you see many images. One of them over there, like I will try to point a finger, that is Swedish Romani artist Lindy Larsson, who works also in Berlin, and he has many different plays, and he's a public figure who is out and quite queer and gay and Roma, but we do not hear about him often, you know, like in the mainstream. I thought that this play beyond, like I wrote an article about Roma Armee and how the revolutionary potential of queerness, you know, like, and what the transformation is within Romani communities is, but we didn't hear, for example, of his play Yes But No, which directly addresses rape and sexual violence against Romani communities, for example, elsewhere. So that is, for example, that is one example. Another one is also that I want to talk about is that a lot of the aesthetics of Romani futurism, that was one of the topics of the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago, rests on the premises of a very queer, outspokenly sort of like queer aesthetic. Which gives me a little bit more work to do, which is a huge pleasure of mine to basically, like, it gives me the space to theorize how I would actually like to interpret it. But I do sometimes wonder why that is the case. So to summarize, sort of like, I do think that, you know, like, queer and feminist communities are at the forefront of creating a paradigm shift and are driving sort of like the discourse in institutions into a different direction, in a decolonial one. But at the same time, we do not have, like many Romani artists, do not feel the freedom still to come out as gay, lesbian, bi, transsexuals, for example, and to sort of like take pride in this. And I think that we need to create like the space to theorize how nationalism within institutionalism is affecting this process. So I will stop here, and the rest I will sort of like take up in the discussion. This would be my entry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arman, for your contribution, and also we are very much looking forward to your PhD. And I think we will learn a lot from this because, as you said, the situation and also the contributions of Roma feminist queer artists and art in general is very marginalized, and even within, you know, the Roma communities and Roma art in general, but of course in the mainstream one as well. So I think it will be really interesting, and hopefully other people, other scholars, activists, artists will also take on this research as well. Thank you so much. Now I would like to continue with Payam, and I'm sure that he will talk about the different initiatives of Slavs and Tatars, so we can learn about your work as well. Please.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you to the fellow participants. Nice to see some familiar faces as well. So Slavs and Tatars in 2018 started to institutionalize on a small, somewhat roguish scale, in the sense that we launched a residency and mentorship program for young professionals from our region, namely, of course, the Caucasus, Central and Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. And this grew out of several sort of desires or motivations. One is that our region, of course, is sorely lacking in arts education. Even the major, let's say, imperial capitals, whether they're Tehran or Moscow, don't have proper art schools. But it's not even a question of regional focus, to be honest. Even in the, let's say, the experience we've had in Western art schools, your more sort of notorious or prestigious ones, they don't really teach artists, cultural practitioners, curators, managers, everybody that's necessary for an art for a healthy ecosystem. They don't really teach the kind of what we consider the back office of what it is to be a cultural practitioner, meaning, of course, the intellectual side we're all engaged with, but nobody's teaching people or showing people how to be financially solvent into their 30s, how to work administratively in terms of how to sort of put your archive in order, how to negotiate fees when you're a curator or an artist with galleries or museums. Basically, all the kind of non-sexy kind of nuts and bolts of what it means to work as an artist or a cultural practitioner. So that was we started this 2018 actually, and it began it was a result of an invitation from an institution in Belarus before the protest, of course, in 2018. And we thought it doesn't make sense, we noticed that we were starting to get invitations from our region to show, and of course we'd like to show our work and engage with publics in our region, but that's not the best expenditure of public money to bring an exhibition of Slavs and Tatars to Minsk or to Yerevan. We thought, why don't you in fact send people to us, and we'd love to work with them. And that's I would say the particularity of this residency and mentorship is that the resident spends 3 days a week or 2 to 3 days a week integrated into the studio. And because we're not a kind of traditional artist collective or practice in the sense that we're not, art as such only represents 40 to 50% of what we do. At any given moment, there's a publication being prepared, research. Recently, we've started to curate as a kind of masochistic practice to understand how difficult curating is, and we've always knew that, but it's financially ruinous compared to being an artist, I must say. And other activities, the pickle bar as well, and that was the second initiative. Was we shortly after that launched a space or opened a space 4 or 5 buildings down from our studio, which is a small space called Pickle Bar. The idea was to also invite other lecturers, poets, writers, performers to engage with the limits of the tongue, and the limits of the tongue meaning, not, of course, in today's day and age when language is being weaponized, not only language as discourse, but also language as affective space. The Pickle Bar, in a very selfish way I could explain it also, is that I've never really believed in wine and cheese. I think it's a really bourgeois and unhealthy way to enjoy oneself, and I think that fermented items and spirits are just much healthier. But also, fermentation is for us, of course, a kind of prism or an agency to think about other legacies, whether they're legacies of the Enlightenment or legacies of rotting and preservation, of course. So the Pickle Bar, we're purely the kind of host, again, like the residency. We're like the MC or the host. We provide the kind of the scenography and the opportunity for others to have a platform. And that's been both initiatives in their own way have been I'm very happy to see them sort of have a life of their own, in the sense that, first of all, I should say that it's not the founders of Slavs and Tatars are not the ones who run Pickle Bar residency. It's actually 2 other individuals who are Patricia Couvet and Anastasia Marochina, and they and what's been fantastic also is a kind of it's in some sense it's allowed a gathering of micro communities that normally don't have. I mean, what's quite unfortunate is in our region, we were just talking about this over lunch. Very few people in Georgia in the artistic scene in Georgia have ever been in the Caucasus, have ever been to Central Asia, right? So everybody goes through the imperial capitals again. So everybody goes either to Moscow or goes west previously. And this was, for us, it's important to to create or to reclaim, and that's why Slav and Tatars was founded, in some sense, a certain sense of commonality that's not top down, but that's that allows the Armenian diaspora in Berlin with the Ukrainian diaspora in Berlin and the Kazakh diaspora in Berlin to kind of find a space of meeting that is not one that has been determined by a Soviet legacy, let's say. Yeah, those and a kind of a tertiary effect of this has been we didn't plan this, but it's been that it's enabled us to reclaim Slavs and Tatars as a platform as opposed to a name of a collective. Because what's unfortunate is that human nature is that people want to reduce a collective to individuals, and it never sat comfortably with me or with Kasha or others that at the end of the day people asked me or somebody specifically to attend an opening or to write a text. In fact, Slavs and Tatars was always meant to be a platform for others for people to kind of a work to be done, but it didn't matter who was behind that work. And that's something that institutionalization allows for, is a certain sense of, I would say, a good sense of anonymity, or kind of away from the individualism of that art is so driven by. Obviously, I mean, there's still no matter what happened in Documenta last year or the trends of collectivism, of collective artists, the fact is that people want to know who is behind it, where are they from, where did they study, and we just find that to be an unhealthy line of investigation. So yeah, that's briefly about sort of the recent initiatives. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Payam, for your thoughts and also work that you are doing in your region. I think it really much resonated with what Natali said about community-based art and how the community actually many times decides about how we think about and how we do art. So in different contexts, such as the Ukrainian war, you really have to look at the experiences and feelings and the conditions of the given community. In her cases, the Roma youngsters as well. So it was really interesting to see how two different contexts is actually how it resonates with each other. Thank you so much, Payam. Now I would like to hand the floor to Lara, who will talk about the Palestinian context, and she will also talk about how archiving is done in museums in Palestine and how you can and how actually you are reforming it. So Lara, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation, and yeah, nice to meet and see everyone here. So I'm in Amsterdam now, and have been running the Appel for only the past few months. But today, actually, I was reading from After the Last Sky by Edward Said, because in a bit we have a reading group here. We host a reading group on the book, and there I read Said writes that there are a few opportunities for us Palestinians to learn anything about the world we live in that is not touched by or even soaked in the hostilities of our struggles. So in a sense, being away from Palestine, in a sense, we always see the world from the perspective of institutions. I see it from this lens of working for quite a long time on research and writing, but a larger debate or conversation that is happening with my generation in Palestine around museums being built in Palestine over the last 15 years. So because there's been a proliferation of museum building. And these museums are, in a sense, impossible museums because of a structural contradiction between the struggle for emancipation, an ongoing struggle, and the foreclosure of the struggle in the museum itself. So there are many contradictions in museum building, making these museums at many times empty, obsolete, and also impossible. So I'm speaking about the many that have recently opened. There are specificities, of course, but some of these museums include art exhibitions. But just to name a few to get a sense of it, like the Bank of Palestine Museum collection, Natural History Museum, Mahmoud Darwish Museum, Yasser Arafat Museum, the Palestinian Museum, a virtual Nakba Museum. There's a one kind of touring modern and contemporary art museum at the Institute of Arab Art in Paris. So also in diaspora, museums in diaspora, across in Palestine and in the region. And museums being built today in Palestine are based on the model of the modern museum, right? The modernist museum. So, which was created by modern national states with an aim to save the treasures of the ancient regime, right, from ultimate destruction. Boris Groys writes about this a lot, in the sense that the birth of the modern museum starts with the Louvre. But where it's also the site for the formation of the nation-state's cultural identity, as it contains the universal and exotic in contradiction with the national self. So the myth of the nation is also formed at the museum. I mean, we all experience this. We depend on museums, or states depend on museums to forge our cultural identity, but the tension is always there, right, between the universal, which remains as a threat to the national identity. So these new museums, new Palestinian museums, aim to collect objects pertaining to national identity and tell stories of the struggle, right, against colonialism. However, the national identity is in constant transformation because, again, the struggle continues. And the exhibits are usually about the struggle for emancipation, and then thus presenting it as finished and a closed event. In the sense, the magic of the museum is that it turns the object into evidence for the expiration of a regime, an ideology or an era, but that has not, in fact, ended. So my inquiries about this depart from this paradox, right, represented in the impossibilities of museum building under current political circumstances. In short, the contemporary political atmosphere is still defined by military occupation, colonialism. In the mid-90s, the Oslo Accords, many of these museums were built after the mid-90s, or started, the plans started in mid-90s after the Oslo Accords set in place the Palestinian Authority as a self-governing body in areas of the West Bank and Gaza, from which the Israeli army had withdrawn. However, the PA never developed into a viable independent state because of the failure of further negotiations and an explosion of the Second Intifada. So under the mutated colonial conditions, the PA today is a non-sovereign entity, which has some, but not at all, the most features of the state. And so it is not sovereign on land, right? It cannot protect these museums. The museums are also empty because many artifacts are still in Israeli colonial museums or have been captured in a sense there. Yeah, as I mentioned, Boris Groys writes a lot about the Louvre being, that the roots of our definition of the modern museum derives from a conversion of the Louvre from a palace to a museum, specifically when revolutionaries decided that instead of a destructive iconoclastic gesture, like the demolition of the palace, they would aestheticize the building, turning it into art. So by robbing it of its function, make it obsolete. So the museum then becomes a site which institutionalizes the radical atheistic revolutionary violence that demonstrates the past as incurably dead. But this is not to suggest that the museum becomes a graveyard, but because the graveyard is a place full of potential, specifically the potential for spirits and specters to return, in a way. Of course, this association with the modern museum, with the revolution, as well, makes the museum post-revolutionary, post-colonial, right? As it is often one of the first institutions to be built in post-independence. So it's a contradiction, again, where you have in a colony a post-colonial institution, in a sense. Because in the Palestinian context, time outside the museum is still under settler colonialism, and resistance to it is still underway. So while the debate around decolonizing the museum is rooted in post-colonial time, the colonization of Palestine continues, and the struggle against it ensues as a kind of elongated present. So I was, thinking about how looking at these different museums, new museums, the impossibilities that they represent, looking at features and kind of how audiences, how artists kind of work to reveal these contradictions, but also to kind of put on a different lens to look at other forms of museums, right? So like museums of struggle or museums of resistance, for example. So maybe I just mentioned two kind of as examples, and then I stop. There is work by Noor Abu Arafi in a video that's called As If I Have Never Been in This Place Before on Sunday, 7 p.m. A video by the artist where the museum is presented as an institution which attempts to represent the collective but ends up representing only itself. In the video, we hear a voiceover chronicling a story of a traumatized character, one that's devoid of memory and who visits the museum in order to remember. Describing one of the museums he has visited, he says, he describes it as white on white on white. We understand from the voiceover that a few years later, the man visits a different museum where he discovers an exhibit that documents visitors to the first museum, including himself. Confronted by his own personal memory, is reduced to an archive, the man begins doubting memory altogether, right? So it does exactly the inverse. And as the film closes, we slowly notice that the man resembles the museum also that he has been describing. The voiceover also mentions that the museum is devoid of memory, and in fact find out that this museum is the Palestinian museum. And actually there are sounds in the video coming from the opening of the Palestinian museum, which opened empty. That's a different story. But maybe just another example from history, from Palestinian history, where it's more kind of defining of a museum of resistance, right? A museum engaged in struggle, one that is outside of time. So during the first Intifada, which is in '87, it's a popular upheaval that was against military occupation, but also in literature, in art, in general, like socially progressive. So during the first Intifada, there were these underground communiques that were printed and were illegal to disseminate. And they were discarded by burial. So they were deemed illegal by Israeli military, and any Palestinian caught reading or in possession of these was arrested. So the communiques had to disappear after they were read. Burning was not an option since the traces are incriminating. So it is said that they were dumped in wet concrete construction sites or buried underground. The future material exposure of these documents implicated their readers and authors. So it's precisely the danger of the exhibition of a material archive during a struggle, right? Any record is incriminating. So to be outside of time is to be outside of the reaches of the archive and surveillance. And through the collective practice of struggle and resistance that a community can attempt to be kind of outside time, outside the museum. And it's like through preserving this secret together that was buried. So it's a kind of, I look at this, it's kind of a myth, oral myth as some form of a museum of struggle rather than these kind of national or attempts at these national museums where it is not yet time in a sense of a national museum. Yeah, sorry for taking so long. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lara, for your contribution. It's really always interesting to hear how other marginalized communities cope with different struggles. So I think we have a lot to learn also from the Palestinian context as well. Thank you so much for all the speakers. Now, before I open it up for questions for the audience here, I would like to ask one question from all of our speakers, so you also have the chance somehow to reflect on each other's interventions and work as well. So my question is, where do you see synergies between each other's work? And anyone who feels like to go, please go ahead.
Maybe I can, because there was one striking thing that Lara actually mentioned, and that is the relationship between the museums and temporality, right? And that is, temporality is my recent, actually, obsession. And I really think that it is, you know, like, especially in something that you mentioned settler colonialism, while the Roma actually, you know, like the colonial legacy towards the Roma is very differently conceptualized, and it is not, you know, like territorial because the Roma do not have a state, but the relationship with temporality is a point of convergence, I think, for both of us, because it is very crucial in the colonial project. And it is, how do you say it, like for Romani communities across Europe, but what I also see oftentimes through Palestinian queer activism, especially in Israeli pinkwashing, for example, is that this narrative of backwardness, Palestinian backwardness in terms of understanding sexual minorities is very similarly used as for Romani communities in order to sort of like mark us as communities that do not belong to the present, but rather put us in need for further colonization and for further sort of like interventions in order for us to be civilized. So this is like one of the points that I really saw and that immediately rang a bell. But it was also very interesting to see, you know, like what you described as the relationship with temporality. So I will stop here, but that was very striking to me.
Great, thank you so much, Arman. Anyone else?
Yeah, I also put, sorry for the background noise. I can give also a short connection that I've seen within the Laura's presentation as well. It's about general decolonization concept, and I can say that within the Ukrainian Roma context, it's a bit different due to the fact, yeah, as Arman said, the colonization in general for the Roma people is not that clear as for other contexts and countries, but within the Ukrainian context nowadays, because of the war, happens this decolonization from the Soviet structure. And within this context, like I see there is a mix, like how to decolonize Ukrainian institutions from the Soviet system, as well from this racist attitude towards ethnical minorities. So it's double in case of Roma. And thank you, Laura, for the opening a discussion on itself a museum as institution and as a physical space. Rather, it has a sense to exist such brick institutions from stone nowadays, or rather we are on a time when to go into virtual, or whether how we can combine these two and create the institutions of future that will be inclusive.
Yeah, thank you, Arman and Natali. I also saw many convergences as well, and with Payam. So some of the notes I have are like when Natali talked about how she's interested in community members determine what is Roma heritage themselves. So this also that we also this makes us think about redefining these fields of in general of work. What is heritage? What is the museum? Right? It's because we are outside of it, right? Because we yeah, I was thinking about this. Like it then we have to kind of we are compelled, right, to question first the field in order to be able to kind of posit what we want to say about it. So yeah, this was really nice. Like that also. How do you break out of these defined terms, right, of what is heritage by asking the community members by defining, and then also Arman when talking about exoticism of Roma people, and now about how we are placed in the past, right, using time. As a kind of tool or instrumentalizing time, not only history but time against us, and then how to kind of learn to evade it through like wondering also about this through leaving the institution. So I was also appreciating how Payam was speaking about the collective and anonymity, right? It allows for you to be outside of the institution, to work with community and not to be exposed in a sense, or more a sense of community of building these definitions of your history and your culture on your own terms. No?
Yes, and I just wanted to add to this question of temporality is a very interesting one. I think because I just it reminded me of a discussion that we've been very much interested in this idea of how the East looks eastward, and I think that when we're talking about decolonizing practices, we're all in some sense descendants of downstream in some sense of Said's Orientalism, but also people like Spivak and others. At the same time, it's important to understand the limits of both these scholars, or many of the scholars that we take to be kind of the canons of this kind of thinking, because I've noticed this in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is there's been a little bit too much of too easy of a take up of Western neoliberal models, American-inspired models of decolonization practices, or let's say kind of from the U.S. Academy. And I think this is, we're not of course against that. I think that it's just one type of knowledge that we need to be able to also balance those types of knowledge productions with other forms of knowledge production. I think that and the question of temporality is that if we want to, for example, the question of multiculturalism has been brought forward as a kind of, by some people as a kind of, as a solution to the Soviet sort of practice of mnogonationalnosti, of like multinationalism, which was really quite a racist also way of kind of determining different peoples, narods, and sort of saying each has their literature, each has their costume. And it just reminded me of this one determination that actually both systems, meaning multiculturalism or neoliberalism and the kind of the Bolshevism of mnogonationalnosti, talk sort of how they talk about the ethnic minority both being backwards because they come from a kind of backwards place, but also being avant-garde in the sense that they have this both temporality, because they're presented by the Soviets, they were presented as a kind of post-national, diversity, and also by neoliberal society as a kind of, that they are the future, right? So that the minority is the future as well as the past at the same time. And this is a kind of this is an impossible place to be in some sense, right? You cannot be both sort of behind time and in front of time. Actually, you don't exist, as opposed to being in the present. If you want to kind of use a very cheesy kind of spiritual way of looking at it, that's where you exist, is in the present, really, and not in the future or in the past,
Thank you so much. It's really a great and very interesting discussion. I just wish that we had more days to sit down, in a physical space, so we can really go into the depth of it. Now, if you don't mind, I would like to open up the discussion and also for questions from the audience. So is there anyone who has any comments or questions to our speakers? Okay, Kati.
Hello. So you were also talking about the future, and maybe it's a stupid question, but can you imagine an ideal scenario for institutional? I cannot pronounce this word. So to become more focused on becoming institutions, or how to go ahead with your struggle in relation to institutions.
I mean, I can give a very short. I don't know if it would be answer, just my opinion on how I see it and using my research as well. Like I was talking about the shared authority. For me, it's a key concept. Like while, for example, in future, choosing the objects for future archive, who is on a position to decide what should be taken? Yeah, and there should be, on my opinion, some special working groups organized who consist like with different experts, community members, like human rights experts, media people, like content writers, social media, also people who work more deeply with history and authenticity concepts, and how all these parties can negotiate and find common ground. Of course, I imagine that it will be super difficult, but on my opinion, that's maybe the approach for future, not like the authority or someone is deciding what should be taken, but rather discussions should be created around there to make a choice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned human rights activists, media personalities or media experts, besides, curators and those people who were educated in arts, because I think even until nowadays we tend to think about art and artistic institutions, something which is, you just put it in a sealed aquarium, and no other experts, or people with different fields can enter this, only just those people who educated in many years in art, and on this field. So I think our societies are just much more complex, and I think, as you mentioned, Natali, there should be also other aspects and different perspectives that should be taken into consideration when we think about museums and how we should collect the different artifacts. So thank you so much for that. Is there anyone else? Arman?
I would just maybe like to add the socialist legacy. I don't know whether that is popular or not, but like I was born in Yugoslavia, so people can think about Yugoslavia whatever they want, but it was a different relationship towards art in that time. And I think the reason why I do the things that I do nowadays is because of the sense of entitlement that I sort of have coming from the system that art belongs to me. Being in a Western system where, like now I live and work in Sweden, I can see that the perception is very different and it's very, like rigid. And there's a set of rules and there are protocols and there are tons and tons of regulations that you need to go through in order to make a change. But these changes are not really impossible. The thing is only that this is where I connect community with institutions. I think that as community, the strength is and the potential is actually in the numbers. We do have artists, for example. We need to create, like a firmer dialogue between artists, activists, scholars, create spaces like these we can press institutions to make a change. Many of these institutions need to acknowledge the fact that, you know, like the Roma are national minorities in many of the states that have institutions but are not represented or underrepresented in these institutions. And I know how it works, for example, in Sweden. To a certain degree, it is a little bit of a good example is that, you know, like I apply, for example, to the National Cultural Fund when I want to sort of like make an intervention. And you have that right as a minority to make that sort of like a claim that you can ask for resources. And I think that, you know, like the European structures and the European Union can be used. I know that many of us live in very dark states where democracies are under attack and European sort of like union resources are pretty much the only light at the end of the tunnel, I think. But one can use those as well in order to create, you know, like a different narrative, because many of those, they're not ideal. None of this is ideal, but it is, you know, like working towards different institutions that acknowledge the differences within the community. So I will stop here.
Lara, Payam?
Yeah, I think the institution in struggle or the museum in struggle could be a long list of other things, right? Like I remember in one of the conversations with some friends, someone was saying instead of building the Palestinian museums, why not a forest? Why not a land for agriculture that's commonly owned by the members of the community? Why isn't that considered a museum? Or why not kind of also change the definition of what a museum is, but also looking at, for example, the model of the community center from the 70s, where it's not about a surgical curatorial presentation of only artists, or it's a multitude of different things happening of the community taking over the space as well, and also I think a kind of maybe this like not to be fearful, like someone mentioned the NGO as well, like you know, after Oslo Accords, and I think that you probably have these experiences as well, is that this NGOization comes in. It's the American model, and you have cultural institutions become apolitical, and I think this also, like not to be fearful of some form of political affiliations. I'm in awe of, for example, the Rojava Film Commune and how they work all together on producing films where there's a basic income. They are considered part of the commune, but making film. So there are many also kind of models from history and blueprints to look at and take towards the future, but to be open also towards the definition of the cultural institution and the museum, and to be, you know, I think that in a sense time also to be present in the present, no, like echoing what Arman and Payam were talking about as well.
Okay. I don't know, Payam, if you would like to say a few last words, then if not, I think I will close this panel, unfortunately, because we have a performance coming up. I thank you so much for everyone for this discussion, especially to our speakers who were talking about how us as marginalized communities struggle and struggle with the formal art institutions, and also what are the possibilities to challenge these institutions and formal museums, and how we can create a community and how we can shape today's societies, even just temporarily, maybe. So thank you so much. Hopefully we will continue these discussions in the future as well. And now I would hand it to